I'm from the economics department, so I'm here to talk to you about economics, which is in the Division of Social Sciences. And there's a couple of examples I have that do come from professors who work in the business school. So the Division of Social Sciences incorporates about 12 or 15 different departments. You can see that on the slide there. African American studies, anthropology, cognitive science, demography, economics, ethnic studies, gender and women's studies, geography, history, international and area studies, linguistics, political science, political economy, psychology, and sociology. All of those are departments within the Division of Social Sciences. So we're all in this together in terms of thinking about humanity and coming up with different ways of thinking about how to answer questions having to do with people. So that's what the social sciences are all about. Some of what I'm going to talk about today is applicable to any of the social sciences and to any of the fields generally, and some of it is specific to economics. So while we're still working on the computer and trying to get that ready, let me start by asking you to think about a question. And the question I want to have you think about is, what is one of your most memorable classes? So of the classes you've taken, I should find out, how many of you are entering freshmen? How many of you are transfer students? All right, looks like we're about 90% entering freshmen. So think about the classes that you've taken over the last, 13 or so years. And I want you to think about, what are some of the most memorable, or one of the most memorable classes that you took? So we're pondering. Are we pondering? Pondering. Now what I'd like you to do is introduce yourself to the person sitting next to you and tell that person, what's the most memorable class and what made it memorable? Well, you're not talking to anybody. You should join that group. Join that group. Huh. All right. Got to go on the other side. Here I come. All right. I got to come around this side because I was stuck over there on the other side. So let me go over here where I didn't meet people before. Hi. What's your name?
I'm Haywa.
Hi. Nice to meet you. I'm Professor Olney. So, you ready?
Yeah.
So tell me, what was one of your most memorable classes and what made it memorable?
So I would say history.
Uh-huh.
Because I thought history was all about memorization, but then I realized that it was really not all about memorization. It's more about like reading, writing, and analyzing data. So
Okay.
yeah.
So history, because you thought it was going to be a bunch of memorizing, and it turned out not to be that after all.
Yeah.
Cool. Hi, what's your name?
I'm Jonathan.
Jonathan, are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. What's one of your most memorable classes and why? This is Jonathan.
Probably my calculus class.
Calculus.
Because my professor would always buy the class pizza.
Ah. So calculus. You guys are so GBO ready. It's like anybody says anything and you're like, yeah. Oh, but let me try this one. Stanford. No, that's not what you do. Okay, where's some of my, are there any GBO counselors here? Any returning students? What do we do when we hear the word Stanford? Yeah. Okay, so now you got it down. So you guys are good. GBO, you cheer for everything except if somebody says Stanford, and then you... Okay. Anyway, calculus, because they bought you food. Anything else? Just that? Just the food?
Yeah, there's one more.
Okay.
He would always like let us use like a full page of notes before a test. I mean, like on the day of a test.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So let you bring in a page of notes?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we got history, because it turned out not to be just memorizing. We got calculus, partly because of the food. You know, food's really important because what food does is food helps us to create community. There's a lot of fellowship and community building that happens over food. So food's actually really important. And the other piece was being able to bring a page of notes into the exam, which actually goes back to what she said, because then you don't have to memorize as much, right? Because then you can really focus on learning the concepts and applying the concepts. All right, cool. Who else do I have? You ready? Okay, what's your name? Harrison? All right, Harrison, what you got?
My favorite class was probably AP Statistics.
Statistics, okay.
Because I'm a big sports nerd kind of guy. So my teacher, every day he'd bring in like a new sports case and we'd analyze it.
Ah, so statistics, because it wasn't just memorizing a bunch of stuff from statistics, but it was taking the concepts and applying it to contemporary real-world situations. Yeah. We got a theme going here. You sort of catching that? We're starting to develop a theme. I got 3 examples, and all 3 examples so far are really about having a class in which it's not just memorizing, where it's not just a bunch of facts or something to be memorized, but where you're learning things and applying them. And I think even the example about bringing notes into an exam is an illustration of that, because when you can bring your notes into an exam, when you can bring notes into the exam, then you don't have to be concerned with the little things that you have to memorize, and you can learn and think more deeply, even during the exam. And you can, from my side of this table, you can ask deeper and more difficult questions when you can bring notes in. You probably noticed that, huh? Let me get a couple more. See, no, I still don't have slides. Well, that's all right. We'll work on this. You want to take a turn? Sure. What's your name? Angelina. Angelina, what's one of your most memorable classes and why?
So for me, it would probably be my reading and comp class. It was a dual enrollment course offered at my high school, and I liked it because it really sparked my interest in political econ, because our professor made us read novels about people who were part of like social justice movements, and they were all people of color, and so I really felt inspired to use that towards a degree in political econ.
Cool. So another example of concepts that then were being applied to, and oftentimes to situations where you didn't realize that's what you could do, right? A lot of people come in thinking that economics is all about finance. Oh my heavens, no. There's like 1 finance course, maybe 2. But all the rest of it is really cool, funky stuff. All right, let me get one more, and then we'll see if I have it. Do I have slides yet or no? Okay. One of you guys want to take a turn? No? No? Okay, what's your name?
Aaron.
Aaron. All right, shh. Aaron, what's one of your most memorable classes and why?
Philosophy.
Philosophy?
Yeah.
Wow. In high school?
No, I'm a transfer.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So it's still, wow. Cool. Okay, how come?
Just because it challenges your beliefs and it makes you kind of see the world from different perspectives.
All right. This is actually, you may think I planted him, but I didn't. So philosophy, because it challenges your beliefs and makes you think about things from a different perspective. That's a lot of what I want to talk about. You didn't get to see my first slide, but what it said was what we're going to talk about today is critical thinking and how that's applied in economics, specifically because that's my field, and in the social sciences more generally. I want to start, we can turn this one off. I want to start, though, before I talk about methods of critical thinking. I've got some cool graphs I'll have to show you with my hands. To talk about briefly the difference between active learning and passive learning. So this may be phrases that you've already heard, but I want to underscore them, and for many of you who are coming in as first-year students, I want to really emphasize that active learning is not, oh, that's so high school. Active learning is how people learn. So when we talk about active learning versus passive learning, I like to think about passive learning as when you're sitting and you're listening, or you're taking notes, or you're reading a book, or you're highlighting something in the reader, but you're not really engaging with the material. So there's not new examples that are being brought into the stats class, and you're trying to figure out how to apply those things. There's nothing, your hands aren't moving, your mouth isn't moving. It's just a very sort of lulling you to sleep kind of experience. As opposed to active learning is any time there's something going on that's basically engaging your brain in a way where you're interacting with the material. And what a lot of research has shown is that people learn things better through active learning. An example a lot of people like to use is if you are trying to, let's say, assemble some furniture from Ikea, just to come up with a random crazy example. If you're trying to assemble some furniture from Ikea, you could read the instructions and then go away and see if you can remember how you would assemble that piece of furniture from Ikea. Or you could actually find that silly little wrench and assemble the furniture from Ikea, so an active process of engaging with learning, and assemble that piece of furniture from Ikea. The odds are you're going to remember how to assemble Ikea furniture better once you've physically done it, once you've been actively involved in the process, than you would if all you did was read the instructions and then go away. So actively engaging with anything, be it neuroscience or philosophy or statistics or calculus or economics or anything else, actively engaging with that material is a way to embed the knowledge that you're gaining in a place in your memory or in your mind, in your brain, that allows you to both retrieve that knowledge later and to apply that knowledge to different scenarios. So you learn the basic statistics, but then you know how to apply it. You learn how to apply it to basketball or football or some other sport. You learn the basic statistics, but then you are able to apply it to a craps game at the casinos from active learning. Passive versus active learning. One of the things that the scholars have shown us through various experiments that psychologist-type people do is that active learning disproportionately benefits students from underrepresented populations and students who are first generation. That active learning as opposed to passive learning in terms of how much people learn, how much they comprehend, how much they retain, disproportionately benefits students from underrepresented communities and students who are first generation. It benefits everybody. I'm not saying it doesn't benefit everybody else. It benefits everyone, but it disproportionately benefits those groups of students. And so what you'll find is in a lot of your classes here, there are a lot of ways in which we encourage and require active learning, that you're not just contrary to what somebody may have falsely told you. You're not going to just sit in a lecture hall like this and take notes for 50 minutes or an hour and 20 minutes and then walk away. There's going to be a lot of active components to the classes that you're taking. Now, oh, my cute little graphs. One of the things that the neuroscientists here at Berkeley have taught us is that one of the reasons that active learning is beneficial is that there's a relationship between the stress hormone cortisol and the amount of learning that we're able to do, or another way of is sort of how much our brain opens up, absorbs information, and how well it allows that information to go zip, 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 zip through our brain and make these cross connections in our brain. Now, cortisol is the stress hormone. If you have no cortisol being released, if you're under absolutely no stress, so 8:20 a.m. snoozing in class. If you're under no stress at all, then we're going to have a curve here. You can see it on the screen. We're going to have cortisol along the horizontal axis, so how much cortisol is being released. And on the vertical axis, we're going to have how much learning takes place. And what we've got is a bell-type curve, right? So if there's no cortisol being released, so we're over here near the origin, if there's no cortisol being released, there's very little learning that goes on. If there's way too much cortisol being released, right? So if right now a 6.7 earthquake were to happen, there's not going to be a whole lot of learning and knowledge retention that goes on. You're not going to know what I said. You're going to forget what I said in the previous 2 minutes. Someplace in between 0 and way too much is that sweet spot where learning is maximized. And there's a curve. And you know, for some people it may be sort of this shape. Some people it may be sort of that shape. Some people it may be sort of that shape. But for everybody, a little bit, at least a little bit of cortisol enhances the learning because of the way it affects your brain and the way that things are flying around in your brain. Take the neuroscience classes and they'll give you the official terminology, but you'll learn the same thing. I'm an economist. I don't have to know the official terminology. So active learning is in some ways about finding ways of releasing that little bit of cortisol to enhance the learning and enhance the acquisition of knowledge and the ability to apply the knowledge to a variety of settings. So there are active learning strategies that your instructors will use. So for instance, in my Econ 1 class, we're going to use clickers. Clickers are, they're little things actually about the size of my phone. And I'll ask a question in class, and you have a little doohickey, and it has an A, B, C, D, and E number, and then you get to choose. B. D. E is never the right answer, by the way, for me, but just so you know. And having the clicker questions, and you know, they come up periodically. There's a few right when people come into class, and then they're scattered throughout the class. Knowing that there's going to be a clicker question come up, oh my gosh, after she talks about this, probably in the next 5 or 7 minutes, there's going to be a clicker question we have to answer. Having that clicker question come up means that that's active learning. There's a little bit of cortisol released. It's less than when I walked around with the microphone, right? Walking around with the microphone, some of you were sitting there going, oh my God, please don't come to me. No, 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 no. Shh, she's gone, okay, good. Right? That was a lot of cortisol. That was a lot of stress for some people. The clicker is a little bit of stress because you anticipate that you're going to have to think and respond to a question pretty soon. You're going to get some feedback. I like it for this. You're going to get some feedback that lets you know right away whether or not you're understanding what I'm talking about. That's a fabulous piece. What the clickers have done for me in my teaching is they've eliminated the D's and F's in my grade distribution, because I no longer have people who don't know until the midterm that they didn't understand what I was doing. Right? I used to have people who didn't know until they took the first midterm that they didn't have a clue what was going on in class. And now, 6 times a day, they're like, I got that one wrong. I got that one wrong. I'm getting them all wrong. I must not have a clue. Maybe I need to work on this. And so that, for me, as a teacher, that's been the fabulous thing. For you, as somebody who's learning, it provides that little bit of cortisol, which increases those neurons and things fly around and things are embedded better. Other instructor-led methods of active learning include group problem solving or group discussion. So taking a section full of 25 or 30 people and having you in groups of 3 or 4 to work on a problem together or to discuss a reading article together. And again, that's active learning because you are engaging with others and you are verbalizing, you're engaging your brain. And it's a way of helping you to learn the material in a deeper and more applicable way than you would by simply sitting and taking notes. Lab experiments are the obvious example here, right? Anybody who took a lab science, chemistry, biology, physics, whatever your lab sciences were, it was the lab where you really learned the concepts, where those concepts were really driven home for you, much more so than the other part. There are also student-led methods of active learning, things that you can do that have been shown in various studies by the ed psych type of people to enhance learning and enhance your ability to acquire knowledge and apply the knowledge in new situations. So one of the top things that they have found is practice testing. So here you are, and you write your own potential questions for a test, and then you answer them. Maybe you do it in a group, right? You have a study group, people that live in the same housing unit as you, or people who you've met in class, or some other way of connecting with these folks. And so you do practice testing, where you come up with questions, and then you work on answering them, and then you talk to each other about whether or not you did it well. Or maybe there's practice tests that the professor makes available. But in any case, it's something that you're doing off on your own. And that practice testing is a way of putting the information into a better and more retrievable place in your brain. Another thing they recommend in terms of active learning strategies that students can do to enhance their learning is I'm going to call it time management. It's about not waiting until the last minute. So it's about studying a little bit for the class on Monday, and then studying a different class on the same day. So having not just, I'm going to do econ on Monday, I'm going to do poli-sci on Tuesday, I'm going to do English on Wednesday, but do some econ, some poli-sci, and some English on Monday, and some econ and some poli-sci and some English on Tuesday, and so on. So distributing your studying not just in the 3 days before the exam, but over the course of the semester, and not all at the same time. So you're not 10 hours on one subject. In economics, we think about it as diminishing returns. Diminishing marginal returns. So the first hour of studying has a lot of payoff, but if you sit there and you study for, say, 7 or 8 hours, that payoff curve is going to get pretty flat pretty fast. Right? So diminishing marginal returns. It's one of the examples they give as something that students can do. Another thing is, as you read, ask yourself why. You read a passage in whatever textbook you're reading, don't just read it and say, okay, I have to remember what this said. Read it and say, why is that true? Why is that one thing related to that other thing? Why would they say the way to maximize profit is marginal revenue equals marginal cost? Just to come up with an example. Ask yourself why, and then answer the question, right? You have to not just ask, you have to answer the question as well. Asking and answering the why question. Explaining concepts in your own words. That's what teaching is. I always tell people when they're learning to teach, I teach pedagogy to the graduate students. That is, I teach the graduate students how to teach. And explaining concepts in your own words is a fabulous way to take information and embed it deeper and deeper and deeper into your brain in a way that makes it retrievable. That's why study groups are so incredibly valuable. Because in study groups, that's what you're doing all the time. You're meeting together with 3, 4, 5, 7 different people. We have fabulous new space in Moffett Library where you can do this. You're meeting together with other people and you're explaining to each other the various concepts of the course. That's a fabulous way, that teaching is a fabulous way for you to learn the material. Now let me tell you the methods that they have found are not beneficial to learning. Highlighting. I know, somebody gave you a green marker, a pink marker, a yellow marker, and a blue marker, and you're all set. You're like, the definitions are in blue, the concepts are in yellow, the words I don't understand are in pink, the orange is for drawing little pictures on the side of the page. Whatever your color scheme is that you came up with for your 4 different colors of highlighters, one of the things they've shown is that highlighting when you read, diddly squat. Doesn't do anything in terms of learning. So enjoy your colored markers. You know, art is good for all of us. So get some art paper and use them that way. Rereading the text. Oh, I don't understand what's going on. I'm going to read that chapter again. No, don't read the chapter again. Don't read the chapter again. You don't understand what's going on? Go back to the chapter and find some concepts in it that you don't understand and try to explain those concepts to somebody else in your own words. You don't understand what's going on in the chapter? Go back to the chapter, find the passage that you didn't really understand. Ask yourself, why is this true? But don't just reread the chapter. It's not going to do you any good. Passive learning. Passive learning doesn't do diddly squat. Uses up a lot of time, doesn't give you a lot of payoff. Creating keyword mnemonics. Oh my God, you know, we all do this, right? Okay, I have to remember these 5 things. And so this one starts with a P, and that one starts with a, oh, I don't have to think about what word I'm going to spell before I get into this example. Give me a word, 5-letter word that starts with P. Psalm, P-S-A-L-M, you know? And so now I've created a mnemonic. I've created one of those things for memorizing. You're never going to be able to retrieve that information after, like, the moment when you needed it. Forget it. Forget the keyword mnemonics. Explain the concepts to other people. And it should go without saying cramming, you know, that last-minute thing, you've heard of that. You will do it. I know you'll do it. You say right now you'll never do it. You'll do it. But what you're going to find, not so beneficial. All right. So why do we think about all this? Well, we think about active versus passive learning because it relates to models of intellectual development. So models, let me talk about models first. When social scientists generally, economists specifically, but social scientists generally, when we talk about models, What a model is it's really, it's a way of thinking about how to answer a question. So there's some question that we have. We're going to have one later on, what determines fertility? And we come up with a story. So a model is just a story. In economics, it's dressed up in a lot of math and sometimes some graphs. But it's just a story which is an answer to a question. What are the determinants of fertility? We're going to have a model that talks about the determinants of fertility. What's important to keep in mind is that any model that you learn about in any social science class is understood by those of us who do this for a living to apply on average to the population as a whole, but not necessarily to any one individual person. Right? So we can understand the typical human behavior, the on average human behavior, but if you stand one person up on the stage next to me and say, oh, but this person doesn't behave according to the model, I'm just going to shrug, because nobody ever said the model was supposed to explain each and every individual's behavior. But it's supposed to give me a good understanding of what determines behavior on average. I guess I don't really need slides. The slides would have been nice because you would be embedding this information in a different way, but there you go. So the model of intellectual development, it's actually called the model of intellectual and ethical development that I want to show you, is based on the work of two different sets of ed-psych kind of people. One is a man named William Perry, who did his work many years ago, and the other is a group of researchers led by Mary Belenke, who published their work in a book called Women's Ways of Knowing. And in both cases, the model they were developing was an answer to the question of how do people engage with knowledge? How do people engage with knowledge? Not this active versus passive thing, I'm going to come back to that. But more generally, how do people, this is to philosophy, how do people engage with knowledge? How do they understand knowledge, and how do they understand learning? It's 4 stages. So the stages of intellectual development. Stage 1. William Perry had one set of words to describe this, and the Belenke et al. Group had another set of words, but they were essentially describing the same concepts. Stage 1 was called dualism by Perry. I hope that we get the slides eventually, because I like this slide. And it's called received knowledge by Belenke et al. And when people are in stage 1, they understand knowledge to be truth, capital T truth. They believe that there is truth, duality, 0, 1, black, white. They believe that there is truth and there is falsehood. That there is one right answer to the question, 5 plus 3 equals, what if we're in base 6? Oh, never mind, I'll come back to that, right? You believe that there is one right answer to the question, and that knowledge and learning are about finding out what those right answers are. So when people are in stage 1 in duality, they think that there is one right answer, there is truth, capital T truth, and the role of the instructor, the role of the teacher, is to tell you what that truth is, and your job is to memorize it and learn it. That's duality. A lot of people, well, let me say, let me back up, I forgot one piece. When we think about these stages of intellectual development, you don't want to think about a person goes through these stages, chump to chump to chump to chump. What you want to think about is, as an individual interacts with a particular set of knowledge, they go through these different stages, okay? So you can have someone, my wife is a minister, and she'll tell you there are people who are at stage 4 of this scheme I'm going to tell you about with regard to physics, and back at stage 1 with regard to their relationship with God. So people are at different stages at different times. So stage 1 is there is truth. Stage 2 is called multiplicity. In multiplicity, or Belenke et al. Called it subjective knowledge, when people are in stage 2 in terms of their understanding of knowledge, it means that they think there are many truths, there's a variety of truths, and they're just all different opinions. You have an opinion, you have an opinion, you have an opinion, I have an opinion, we all have an opinion. Everybody has their own opinion. Everybody's opinion is equally valid. And then people in that stage think that the role of the student is to basically read the professor's mind, figure out what the professor's opinion is, and then spit that back on the test. That the path to an A is reading the mind of the instructor, spitting back on the exam what the instructor wants to see, whether or not you believe it to be true or not. And that's the path to an A. That's multiplicity. That's where you think there's a lot of different truths, everybody has their own opinion, and there's no way of sorting between them. Step 3 is what Perry called relativism, and what Belenky et al. Called procedural knowledge. So one of the things you need to learn as a side note is that in these large enrollment classes, if you are sitting at the back talking, ladies, if you're sitting at the back talking, your conversation, first of all, I can see you. That's the first thing to know. And the second thing, because a lot of people think, oh, nobody's ever going to see me in these large classes. No, I can see you. The second thing to know is that your voice carries forward. And so it disturbs all the people in front of you. So if you have a question, that's a good time to raise your hand and ask a question. If you're just sitting there chit-chatting, this is not the time. So you have to figure out when's the appropriate time and when's not the appropriate time. Stage 3 was relativism, according to Perry, or procedural knowledge, according to Belenky et al. In this stage, this is where people come to understand that it's not just there's a whole bunch of truths that are opinions that are equally valid, but that the knowledge of this particular field is affected by assumptions. That the knowledge is affected by assumptions, that some of those assumptions are good assumptions, and some of those assumptions are bad assumptions, and the good assumptions lead us to a model that does a good job of capturing behavior, that is, of answering the question that we're trying to answer, and the bad assumptions take us down a road that doesn't help us to understand what's really going on. It doesn't help us to answer the question. In this third stage of relativism, this is where in whatever field you're in, you learn the methodology of that field for how to critique an argument. Someone presents a model, and the method's going to be different in sociology, in history, in economics, in chemistry, in philosophy, in literature. There's going to be slightly different methods to how you go about doing this. But part of becoming a scholar or a student in a particular field is learning what are the methods that are used in this particular field for critiquing, for criticizing arguments. That is, for thinking critically about the models that are being offered, about the stories that are being told, about the answers that are being constructed in answer to particular questions. Stage 3. Our goal is that everybody, by the time they graduate, is at stage 3 in the field in which they are majoring. That you are able to, in my field, think like an economist. That you're able to interact with arguments, and you know how economists critique those arguments, and you can do those critiques yourself. We don't expect people to be there when they walk in the door at age 18. But we are going to drag you, sometimes kicking and screaming, to that point by the time you graduate. Stage 4, this is the one that scares the graduate students. Stage 4 is called Commitment in Relativism by Perry, or Constructed Knowledge by Belenky et al. And in stage 4, people are constructing knowledge. They're not simply critiquing knowledge that other people have created. They are the ones doing research. When people are conducting their own research, that's characteristic of being in this stage 4, of constructing knowledge, of being the people who create the knowledge. Posing the question, figuring out what assumptions to invoke, what data to gather, and how to answer those questions. I can take maybe you could call Ezra, because I always work with Ezra, and Ezra knows how to get my computer work. I use this computer every time when I teach, so if you can call Ezra and see if he could come help, that would be helpful. Thank you. Okay, so when we talk about research, people conducting research, research is a question that somebody's going to ask. I'm going to have a bunch of examples. Sorry. It's all right. This is why you always have backup. I'm going to have a bunch of examples to show you. Research is people asking a question, coming up with a method, and the method varies by field for answering that question. So you can have the same question in different fields, and you'll have different ways of answering the question. And then coming up with an answer. That's research. A question, a method for answering the question, and then an answer. It's a story. Doing research is telling a story according to the rules of the field that you're studying. And the rules are different in econ than they are in other fields. In every, oh, I so wish I had my slides. Where is this one? In every field, the research that we do, the models that we develop, the stories that we tell, are influenced by assumptions. They're always influenced by assumptions. Now, in economics, those are assumptions about human behavior in the economic sphere, how people behave in a sort of economic context. In a different field, they're going to be assumptions about different things. But we have to make some assumptions about something, depending upon what field we're in order to conduct the research, that is, in order to answer these questions that are being posed to the models. I'm getting back to the active learning part. The really fun thing to learn how to do is how to critique those models. And you critique the model by challenging the assumptions, Now, Chancellor Christ yesterday talked about the importance of free speech. I was there. I thought that was pretty cool. How was the big C thing last night? Cold? Oh yeah, the fog came in, didn't it? Yeah, but the picture was cool. Yeah, okay. Was it like 2 hours to stand there for one picture? Oh, well, somebody had a great idea and didn't think about the time. Anyway, I liked yesterday. So Chancellor Christ yesterday talked about the challenge that we face, right? Which is the challenge of free speech and safe space, and how to bring those things together. And the importance in a place like Berkeley of learning how to engage in conversation with people that you disagree with. We're going to have lots of opportunities, apparently, to do so. So learning how to engage with people that you disagree with. That's part of critical thinking. Thinking critically, which is to say, engaging with someone else's argument, finding the key assumptions in their argument, and then challenging those assumptions, that's critical thinking. That's the key part of engaging with somebody you disagree with. So in my classes, I teach a 5-step method. 5-step method for how to critique an argument. It's right here. It's on the screen in another world. Step 1, replicate the argument. So you get into a conversation with someone whom you disagree with, or you read an article that makes, or a paper or part of a textbook that makes an argument that you disagree with. The first thing you're going to do in critiquing that argument is you want to replicate the argument. Step 1 is replicate the argument. You need to be sure that you know what the argument is that you're disagreeing with. Right? So for example, somebody says to you, I don't think there should be any public funding of college education. I think students should have to pay 100% of their college education. I don't think there should be any public funding of education because after all, the students are the ones who are going to benefit from the education. You may agree with that, you may disagree with that. We're at UC Berkeley, I'm going to take a guess and think we disagree with that. So just on average, may not be true for everybody in the room, but go with me here, right? Step 1 is replicate the argument. Essentially, if you're in a conversation, it's, let me see if I got you right. You're saying that because the student is the person who will benefit from the education, that therefore the student should bear the entire cost of the education. Is that your argument? You replicate the argument. Replicate the argument. If it's a one-on-one conversation, the other person can say, yeah, that's what I said. If it's a textbook that you're reading or an article that you're reading, that's a good time to go to the GSI or the professor and say, I want to make sure I got this right. Is this the argument they're making? Step 2 out of 5. Step 2 is identify the assumptions that are in the argument. Now, some of those assumptions are going to be what we call explicit. They will have been spoken or written down. They're really easy to identify. You assumed that the benefits to the education accrue entirely to the student. Some of those assumptions will be implicit assumptions. They were important assumptions to the argument, but they weren't written down anywhere. They're not written, they're not spoken, but they have to be true in order for the argument to hold. In order for the conclusion to hold, this little piece over here has to be true. So step 2 is to identify the assumptions. This is actually one of the most challenging parts of the process. It's easy to identify the explicit assumptions, but identifying the implicit ones is not so easy. That's where the more you read in the field, the more you learn in the field, the more able you are to identify the implicit assumptions that people bring to arguments. Step 3. Step 3 is choose one of these many assumptions that you identified and change one. Don't change 6 of them. We're economists, we think about in a mathy kind of way, and we're just taking one derivative, not a whole bunch at the same time. Change one assumption What if instead of assuming all the benefits of education accrue to the individual student, what if instead I assume that, yes, many of the benefits of the education accrue to the individual student, but there are also benefits to your education that accrue to the community as a whole? So what if I change one assumption? Now I'm going to see, once I've changed that assumption, I'm going to run the same logic through the argument and see if I wind up at the same conclusion. Before, when we assumed that all the benefits to education accrue to the individual, we came to the conclusion the individual therefore should pay for the entire education. Now, if instead we assume that, yes, some of the benefits of the education accrue to the individual, you'll have higher income as a result of having a college education, but in addition, there are benefits that accrue to society at large. The higher the college education level in a community, people like those communities better, there are higher voter participation rates, there are lower crime rates, there's more research and development, there are discoveries that go on, there's a lot of benefits we could rattle off. And because some of the benefits to your education are going to accrue not just to you, but to others whom you don't even know and they don't even know you, then the cost of your education should be shared by you and by those others. That is to say, we should have taxes that collect money from the people who will benefit, and then those tax collections are used to subsidize your education. That's called public funding of higher education. That's our model. That's an example of what economists call positive externalities. Education is a product that has very large positive externalities, and therefore, it makes logical sense for there to be public funding of higher education as well as K-12 education. That was step 4. Step 4 was, with your new assumption, argue through to the conclusion. Step 5 comes after 4 on a good day. Step 5 is, now that you've shown that once you change this one assumption, it totally changes the conclusion, now it's on you to go back and find some evidence in support of your alternative assumption. That evidence may be empirical, it may be rhetorical, it may be narrative, whatever. You're going to go back and find the evidence in support of your alternative assumption, because that was the critical assumption. That was the critique. That was the critical thinking piece. Now, how do you learn how to do this? Now I'm back to the active learning. The best way of learning how to do this is yakking it up with other people. Is sitting around with a group of people, going through the articles that you're reading for your upper division courses, and thinking about those articles, and thinking about what are the assumptions in these articles, and what happens if we change this assumption, and which one is the important assumption, and oh my gosh, I think we've got it. Interacting with people, not just reading it and rereading it, and certainly not just highlighting it with your pink, blue, green, purple, I forget what colors I said, highlighters. But active learning, actively engaging. Why is this true? This is only true if we assume this one thing, and what if we don't assume this one thing? Critical thinking. Critical thinking. So what are the sources of the challenges to the models? Sometimes it's our own life experience. I'll have some examples about that in a few minutes. Sometimes where the challenge comes from is you think, the person who wrote this article, built this model, made this particular assumption about human beings behave, and there is nobody in the communities that I grew up in that behaves that way. Say something. I mean, if you're going to say, yeah, but I have one uncle who would never behave that way, models don't apply to every single individual. But if you're going to come to me and you're going to say, there is nobody in the communities that I grew up in who behaves that way, boy, is that an important challenge. So one of the reasons that they say, here's the next slide, diversity makes us smarter. Diversity makes us smarter because when we have diverse groups of people working on problems, the assumptions that get challenged become much broader and more interesting. When people say, that may be your life experience as a white woman who grew up in Oakland, that is not my life experience as a black woman who grew up in Oakland. Diversity makes us smarter because it brings to the front different assumptions and different challenges to those assumptions. And when we challenge the assumptions, that can change the story. We can create new knowledge. That's the new knowledge creation. Changing the assumption is the changing the knowledge, is creating new knowledge by saying, no, that's just not the way the world works for everyone. All right, let's do some examples. So for instance, I told you that there was this model of intellectual development, right? Model of intellectual development, it's based on the work of Bill Perry and the work of Mary Belenky et al. And it's a model, it's a story that answers the question of how do people understand knowledge and learning. It's a model. It's based on assumptions. Let me tell you a little bit about it. Bill Perry, when he came up with the model in the 1950s, he was interviewing Harvard undergraduates. What can you tell me about Harvard undergraduates in the 1950s? Rich, white, male, yeah. Golly, maybe that's a particular set of the population that's not actually going to teach us about the whole population. When Mary Belenky and her co-authors came along in the 1980s, they said, Bill Perry interviewed only male undergraduates. We want to know whether or not females interact with knowledge the same way. And so their work in the 1980s was to broaden the scope, was to do that step 5 of finding the alternative evidence. Because they challenged his model by saying, I think that applies only to men, I don't think it applies to women. And so what they did was they did the work in the standard way for ed psych people. They interviewed, I forget, several hundred, let's say, women of a variety of ages, and asked them a whole bevy of questions and learned about how they interact with knowledge and how they learn. And lo and behold, while they came up with different terminology, they came up with essentially the same stages. So, you know, one was duality and the other was received knowledge, and one was multiplicity and the other was something else, I forget what it was. But essentially they said, hey, how about that? We thought it was going to be different for women than it was for men, but we found out it was the same. They challenged an assumption about gender and found out it didn't make any difference. But it's still the case that this is a model that was based on Western culture, based on predominantly white subjects. So it may well be that this is not a model that helps us to understand how people interact with knowledge and with learning in other cultures, in other races and ethnicities. Now, I have found in my teaching that it's been very helpful. It doesn't describe for me every single student, but it describes for me enough of the student body that I work with that it's been really helpful in terms of how I frame my teaching of intro courses, intermediate courses, upper division seminars, and graduate courses. But that's an example of how you would go about critiquing the model. The next step would be for somebody to interview alternative populations. Another example. Fertility. Fertility, how many children a woman has. Fertility is a subject of economics. It's an important subject of economics. We know that the higher the fertility rate, that is, the more children that women are having, the lower the standards of living. That if we want to foster economic growth, that one of the ways of fostering economic growth is to introduce ways for lowering family size. So there are a lot of people, economic history is my field. That means we talk about economic concepts in the past. Let me not do that again. We talk about economic concepts as they apply to situations in the past. So for instance, I have a great graph that I can't show you, but hopefully Ezra's coming over here to help me. It's like a really cute graph right there. Anyway, studying fertility in the past. And so the question they asked is, what explains the pattern of fertility decline in the United States in the 1800s? So there's two things that we know about fertility in the United States in the 1800s. One thing we know is that it was going down. That is to say, people were having smaller and smaller family sizes. So instead of 8 to 7 to 6 to 5 kids. The other thing that we know is that at any moment in time, that the fertility rate of women in some parts of the country was different than the fertility rate of people in other parts of the country. So Pennsylvania, big families; Massachusetts, small families. So different parts of the country. So the question I want you to think about is if you were building a model of fertility, that is to say, if you were going to say, I think the number of children that a woman has is some function of, depends upon, these things, what would you put into these things? For instance, income. People might say income. The more income a family has, the more children they may have. I want you to think about it, and then I want you to talk to the person next to you again. Come up with some ideas. I won't call on the same people, but I'll be down there in just a second. So come up with some ideas as to what you think would determine fertility. What are the factors that you think would affect how many children a woman had? Nothing like having to make do. Oh, let's see. Let me go this way. All right, here I come. I'm up here. Thank you for still being here. Oh, good. Now you can see my picture. See, there's the picture of fertility. Okay. Awesome. You ready? You want to pass? Okay. You want to say one?
We've been talking about age.
Okay. What's your name?
Jacob.
Jacob. What's one?
Age.
Age. So older women less likely to have children than younger women?
Yeah.
Okay. So that may be true. I can't show you the question. Let me clarify the question. So the notion is, when you're thinking about a woman who's like past her childbearing age, how many children did she have? So we're not looking at how many children does a 19-year-old have versus how many children does a 40-year-old have. We're looking at once you're 50, how many children did you have?
How many children that what?
How many children did the woman have during her childbearing years? So age doesn't get to matter because we're only going to look at people once they've finished their childbearing years. And so we're looking at their completed, what they call completed family size. Yeah, it's okay. You want to try one?
Sure.
What's your name?
Celine,
Celine, what you got?
past like exposure to functional families or dysfunctional families.
Ah, okay. So the experience with other families, right? So both functional and dysfunctional families, but also just what people know of other families, right? May have an influence on how many children people have. You want to give it a shot?
Sure.
What you got? Give me one.
Culture that you were raised in?
So with economists, we have to, when we say culture, we have to get specific. So what are you thinking when you think culture? Religion, right? So religion may be something that influences how many children people choose to have. That's right. Sociology is much more likely to interact with the religion angle. And there's a whole subfield of sociology called economic sociology. And economic sociologists really work with the interaction between economic decisions and religion. It's a very interesting field. Okay, anything else? What else? Somebody else have one? Do you guys have one? Do you have anything?
Family wealth.
Family wealth, all right. So we want to distinguish between wealth and income. Income is the amount of money that people are earning over some time period, so like the annual income. And then wealth is the total value of the assets that you own at any point in time, minus the value of what you owe to others, so minus your liabilities. So both wealth and income tend to be relevant. So the more wealth, the more children, or the less children? More children. It depends. That's right. That's exactly right. So now we get into some of the nuance, right? So that the wealth may matter, but does it matter linearly, so that the more wealth there is, the more children? Or does it go up and then down? Is there a nonlinear relationship? So initially low wealth, not very many children, some wealth, more children, high wealth, low children, right? So there may be a nonlinear pattern. That's where we get into thinking about what's the math. That's in the upper division courses, where we think about what's the math that we want to use to describe it. You got a hand up. Education. Education. All right, education. So educational attainment may have something to do with how many children people have. I see hands down here. Let me come down this way. Yep. Life expectancy. So the individual's life, the parent's life expectancy.
Their life expectancy is higher. We can assume that they have better healthcare and have a more developed society.
Oh, you're embedding a lot of assumptions in one. So is it life expectancy or is it the healthcare availability?
Life expectancy.
Okay.
Correlate with the development of that country. So if they have a higher life expectancy, then that means they're more service oriented because developed countries have higher life expectancy.
Okay, so I don't have the microphone over here. So the argument that you're putting together, and what you want to do when you think about these things is you want to you're peeling back, right? So right now you've got a whole lot embedded in one thing. So what you offered me was life expectancy, and as an economist, what you would say is holding all else constant, how does life expectancy matter? But you don't want to do that. You wanted to have life expectancy, which if you change life expectancy, you're also changing healthcare access, you're also changing what country they're living in, you're also changing some other things. So you have to have, we have to think about things as holding all else constant. In economics, we call that ceteris paribus, the assumption of ceteris paribus. Okay, sure. Right. So the expected mortality of the children may impact how many children the family has. Right. So they may have a goal of having a completed family size of 6, and in order to get that, they have to have give birth 9 times. Yeah. 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 Good. Yep.
Like how old people are when they get married.
How old they are when they get married. That's a good point, right? So that's different than the comment about age, but this is at what point, what age do people get married? If people are getting married at 30, they're likely to have smaller family sizes than if they get married at 19. Yep. Oh, we got hands that are jumping way up high. Yep.
Extreme conditions and incentives, like policies.
Okay, so do you want to give me one example of a policy? There's one that everybody always names first, so go for it.
For example, China has a single-child policy,
yeah,
and Japan is like losing population, so has incentive to introduce new population.
Yeah, good. So one-child policy in China, and then Japan got into trouble because their birth rate was so low, and so now there's incentives to have children, exactly. So there can be government policies that make a difference. I see lots of hands. I'm going to take 1 or 2 more as I head back up to the stage. Yeah.
Rate of industrialization. So like in populations where it's more agrarian, it benefits you to have more children, whereas if it's industrialized, it really doesn't.
Okay, so agrarian, and there, agrarian, what we think about when we talk about the agrarian is we're thinking about children as a labor supply, right? So if you're on a family farm, and there when we think about agrarian, we think about, is there a labor market for farm workers, right? So if there's a labor market for farm workers, then we don't necessarily have to have kids who are going to be the ones that work the farm. But if there's not much of a labor market nearby, say you're off in Nebraska, nobody else lives in Nebraska. Is anybody here from Nebraska? Wow. Okay, welcome. There's no, then you have a lot of kids. If you're someplace where there's a big labor market, not so much. So let me show you, no, I can't show you, Ezra. So the economic historians who did this work, who were looking at fertility in the 1840s, well, 1800 to 1860, the argument that they put together to explain this map, which you can't see, the argument that they put together was that people have children in order to have someone to take care of them in their old age. And that there's sort of an implicit bargain that goes on between children and their parents. And the implicit bargain, particularly think 1800s, the implicit bargain is if you'll take care of mama after Papa dies, because it was usually the father who died first, if you will take care of mama after I die, then I will give you the family farm. Okay? So there was an incentive. There was an implicit bargain between the parents and the children that there would be a certain amount of wealth that the child would inherit in exchange for which the child would take care of the parents in their old age. Then what happens? Then what happens is industrialization and the development, the opportunity to move off the farm. How are you going to keep them on the farm once they've seen Kansas City, right? Everything's going up in Kansas City. They've gone about as far as they can go. They went and built a skyscraper 7 stories high, about as high as a building ought to go, right? Oklahoma. There you go. So once there's stuff going down in Kansas City, there's less incentive for the kids to stay on the farm. And so Daddy says, if you'll take care of Mama after I die, you can inherit the farm. And you say, what would I want with the farm? Have you seen what's going up in Kansas City? They got skyscrapers 7 stories high, about as high as a building's supposed to go. The more job opportunities that there were, the more likely the children were to, in the words of these scholars, default on that contract between the parents and the children. And therefore, the parents realize that they can't rely over time. The parents realize they aren't going to be able to rely on children to take care of them in their old age. And so the parents substitute saving in a financial form for saving through having children. That is, they substitute. The initial version of this paper was called Babies or Bank Accounts, 2 Strategies for a Secure Old Age. So that people substitute bank accounts for babies because the babies are going to grow up to be adults who are going to default on this implicit contract with the parents, and they wind up having smaller families and saving more so that they can fund their own retirement and take care of themselves in their old age. And so then what you get is, in terms of this picture, the more job opportunities there are, and that's correlated with industrialization, the more job opportunities there are in the more industrialized states, in the more industrialized counties, somebody's gone back and done the work with counties, the lower the fertility rate, the smaller the family size from this argument. That's an argument. Now, the process of critiquing the argument often starts with that brainstorming we did. The reason that we did that brainstorming was because oftentimes when people critique an argument, the good place to start is before you ever read what the other person said is to think through what you think might affect whatever it is we're talking about. So in this case, fertility. Because then once you've had this brainstorm and you're not sort of biased by what you read, but which you're thinking, oh my God, this must be some really important, smart professor, because after all, they're at Stanford. Oh God, you're quick learners, thank you. You have already had some thoughts in your head about what things you think might influence fertility. Now, I taught that article for a long time. I was around when they were doing the research on that article. It was when I was a graduate student, way back in the old days. And for me, what was an important part was teaching that article and then having people who come from different cultures than the United States, who say to me, but professor, what about filial responsibility? Not something that they ever took into account, but perhaps an important consideration. A critique of the model that comes from bringing your life experience to the question and saying, that may be true in that setting, in that culture, but how applicable is it in other settings and other cultures? Critiquing an argument. Second example. Oh, I can't see any of my graphs. Oh, I hate that all of these examples are people from Stanford. What is that about? How did I manage to do that? Okay, let me do this one next, because you don't care that they're out of order because I don't have my computer anyway, right? Okay, this is from Christina Romer, who's a professor here at Berkeley. So she's also an economic historian. Most of the examples I chose are from economic historians because that's my field. She's also an economic historian, and she asked the question, is it really true that unemployment in the United States was more volatile before the Great Depression than it was after World War II. So a lot of times when macroeconomists ask questions like this, we kind of ignore the Great Depression, because, why not? And so this was always a comparison that was the pre-1930 data with the post-1948 data. And when people just sort of went online, well, this was before online, but people went to the resource books that we had and would gather the data on unemployment from, say, 1900 to 1980, 90, 2000, and plot it, it would look like the unemployment rate was very volatile before 1930, and then was much less volatile after 1948. So it didn't jiggle, 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 jiggle. This is time on the horizontal axis in unemployment. See, I can draw graphs without having a screen. Pretty good, huh? Yeah. What she did was she said, okay, let's think about how those data from before 1930 were created. Because there was no Bureau of Labor Statistics before 1930. There was no consumer survey before 1930. They didn't have a survey where they called up 65,000 households once a month in the week that includes the 12th of the month and asked them a series of questions and gathered the answers from which they generated an unemployment rate. That didn't start until 1948. So all the data we have about unemployment before 1948 are data that had been created by economic historians. So she said, well, what if I use the same methods that have been used on the pre-1930 data to generate the unemployment rate for the years before 1930? What if I use that method to generate the unemployment data for 1948 on? I mean, there's two ways you could do it, right? You could take the post-1948 methods and apply it to the 1930 and before data, or take the pre-1930 method and apply it to the post-1948 data. The data are such that, the underlying data are such that you want to do it the way she did it. You want to take the 1930 and before method and apply it to the post-World War II period. What did she find out? It was the method. It wasn't the data. It wasn't that there was something more stable about the economy after World War II. It was completely an artifact of the data. That once she took the method that was used before 1930 and applied that to the data that we had from after World War II, the unemployment rate goes 1930, skip the Great Depression, after 1948. That it's equally volatile. So that's an example of identifying an assumption about the way in which the data was created and critiquing the existing model and coming up with something new. Do another example from a Berkeley person. Oh, this one I really need the graph. This is a really cool graph, which I can't explain to you because you can't see it. So this is work by Mian and Sufi, both of whom were here in the Haas School, and I'm not sure that they still are. And they were looking at the 2002 to 2006 housing bubble. So there's a lot of economists in the economics department. There's a lot of economists in the Haas Business School. There are also economists in the public health department. I don't know, we're all around campus. So they looked at the 2002 to 2006 housing bubble and asked whether or not that housing bubble had affected debt accumulation. Did it affect how much borrowing that people did? Now, you can just take the raw data and look at the raw data, but that doesn't give you a very interesting answer. What they wanted to do is they wanted to see if they could find ways of, with the available data, of identifying places where housing prices went up really fast, as opposed to where housing prices didn't go up quite so fast. So that was the first cut they did. And the way they did that was by talking about elastic versus inelastic supply. So the supply of housing is how many houses are available for sale. And elastic means that the quantity of houses supplied responds a lot. It's very elastic, like a very stretchy rubber band. Responds a lot to price incentives. And when you have a relatively elastic supply, it means that prices actually don't go up very much, because a little bit of uptick in the price leads to a whole lot more of that product being supplied. And so then the product is available for people to buy, and the price doesn't have to go up very much to clear the market. Fresno, Merced, Madera, Modesto, all of those places with lots of land where they could build lots and lots of houses were going to be places with relatively elastic housing supply. On the other hand, you have inelastic housing supply. And an area with inelastic housing supply is an area where, when there was an increase in demand for housing, there was not very much building that went on, and so housing prices went up really fast. That's the Bay Area, right? San Francisco, landlocked. Unless we're going to fill more of the Bay in. No, we're not going to do that. We stopped doing that in the 1950s. San Francisco is landlocked. There's just not a lot of way to increase housing. Berkeley, until we started building up, Berkeley, very inelastic housing supply. And still, if you want to buy a house, a single-family home in Berkeley, it's a very inelastic housing supply. So those are areas where the housing prices went up very, very fast, and a lot, because there was not the possibility of increasing building to satisfy the increased demand. So what did they find? They found that household borrowing went up, particularly in the areas where housing prices went up a lot, where the housing supply could not expand. And then they also looked at whether or not the amount of household debt that people had went up more or less for people with low FICO scores versus high FICO scores. So your FICO score, FICO, Fair Isaac Corporation, your FICO score is one number between 0 and 800. That's probably between 200 and 800. They use the same scale as the SAT because they figured people understand the SAT. Your FICO score runs from 200 to 800, and it's a measure of how creditworthy you are. The closer your number is to 800, the better interest rate you'll get, the more likely everybody believes you are to repay a loan. The lower your number is, anything below like 600 is not so good. So the lower your FICO score, the less likely you are to repay a loan, the more likely you are to have run into debt problems in the past and not been able to repay. So what did they find? They found that the household debt soars particularly for the soars particularly for the low FICO score, so they call it the low credit household families. But isn't that different between the high FICO and the low FICO score families in the areas where, I have to put my glasses on to see this one. Yep, I'm reading it backwards. My bad. Okay. For the families with low FICO scores, here we go. For the families with low FICO scores, for the families with low FICO scores, in the areas where prices went up a lot, they really increased the amount of debt that they had. A lot of that was home equity lines of credit, so people borrowing against the increase in the equity in their home. For the families that had relatively high FICO scores, so they weren't debt constrained to begin with. If they wanted to borrow, they could have borrowed. They didn't have to wait for the housing price to go up. There was really no difference in how much additional debt they accumulated, depending upon whether their housing prices were going up a lot or going up a little. So studying, that's an example where they were taking this question about how did housing prices affect debt ownership and really taking and splitting it open and saying, we don't want to think about just how housing prices affected debt ownership. We want to think about it whether there's a difference between the experience of people where housing prices went up a lot and went up a little, and we want to think about it as to whether there's a difference between people who found it easy to get credit and people who were more credit constrained. Okay. Let me do one more example. Another example. This one's from the woman down at Stanford. Carolyn Haxby is an economist at Stanford who studies education. Okay. All right. Okay. You learned. You don't want to do it every time. Oh, and you don't be careful about doing it in class because some faculty get really like, because a lot of faculty here have like done a leave down there, or they taught there and then they taught here, or so they're careful. So be careful. Anyway, but now you know. So Haxby has an amazing data set where she was able to work with the College Board. You remember the College Board people. You love the College Board people. Boy, was that an easy pitch, let me tell you. Anyway, softball pitch right there. She worked with the College Board people, and they gave her all the data. So when you registered for the SAT, and there was that inane 45-minute questionnaire that you had to answer, and it asked you all of those, like, my goodness gracious, I don't know, sort of questions. She got all that data. And she got the data on where people went to high school and what their grades were and what their SAT scores were, where they asked to have their SAT scores submitted, so what were the colleges you chose for submitting your SAT scores, and then what are your answers to all those variety of questions. And then so this is like millions of data points. Then they took the data and they looked at people. Oh, I always forget the terminology. Wait, we got target schools, reach schools, and safety schools. Is that right? So they looked at the schools that people chose and who was choosing target schools and who was choosing reach schools and who was choosing safety schools. And they found a systematic difference based on income. That the what they called the low-income high achievers, so people from relatively low-income families, that came from the answers to those questions that y'all answered before you signed up for the SAT. People who came from relatively low-income families who were doing really well in their high school were much more likely to choose the safety schools and the target schools, and not very likely to choose the reach schools. And the higher income the family was, the more likely the student was to choose the reach schools, right? So y'all are nodding your heads, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So that's the puzzle. Why would that be the case? So why do low-income high achievers over-target the safety schools and under-target the reach schools? Now, we're almost out of time, so I'm not going to run around and have you think about it, but I'm sure you have some thoughts in your head about why that might be true, based on your experience or experience of people you know. Her answer, which I don't think is true, her answer is it has to do with information. That's a really classic economics answer. Her answer is that it has to do with information, that if students from low-income families knew that the sticker price that you see on the website for the school is not the price you actually pay to go to the school, that they would be more likely to apply to the reach schools that tend to be the more expensive schools. And therefore, the solution that they came up with was to try to do a better job of letting people know what's the real price that you'll pay. So you know how you could go online and you could say, this is sort of my quick answer to the FAFSA questions without having to do the whole FAFSA, and there's that calculator now that's going to tell you what's your price for a particular school. Their hunch is that that's going to solve this entirely. I don't think that's true. I don't think that I think they need to talk to people more. But that's an example of where people's life experiences are important for the model. Because I feel like there are not enough life experiences of the population they're concerned about influencing the model, where they think it's all about, oh, if we just have that calculator online and you can see what the real price is, that'll solve all the problems. So that's another example of critical thinking critically in economics. So let me wrap it up. Critical thinking is a golden bear. It's such a good slide. Critical thinking as a golden bear. You know, it's all there. Oh, well, I even had the blue and gold thing down here. Okay, anyway. So learning economics or any other field, what's it about? Learning economics is learning how to identify the assumptions, explain how the assumptions affect the story, offer alternative assumptions, explain how those new assumptions will change the story, and figure out how to offer evidence in support of your alternative assumptions. That's what it means to be an economist. That's what it means to learn economics. That's what we hope to teach you over the next 2 or 4 years, depending upon whether you're entering freshman or entering transfer student. Those same methods that I just went through with the examples I just gave you from research from economists, those exact same methods are useful for conversations. And so now we're back to Chancellor Christ's speech yesterday. Those exact same methods are the methods that you will use to engage in conversation with people you disagree with. Identifying the assumptions. Where are the assumptions where you and the other person disagree? Seeing if you can resolve whose assumption is better. Sometimes there's a resolution. Sometimes it's a data problem and you can dig up data. Sometimes there's not a resolution. Sometimes those differences are what we economists call normative differences. Sometimes they're just, y'all have different values than somebody else. And there's no way, you're going to have to agree to disagree. But at least at that point you've thought critically and you've engaged in conversation and you've figured out why it is that you disagree with somebody. Where is it that the source of the disagreement comes from? Is it from a different value system? Is it from a different goal that you want to achieve? Is it from a difference in terms of the assumptions that we're making about human behavior? Is it a difference in the assumptions we're making about who's benefiting from a college education? All of that is part of critical thinking. All of that is what you're going to learn here at Berkeley. You've heard this a lot, I'm sure already. You'll hear it again. You're going to learn more outside the classroom than you learn in. We hope that the methods that we teach you inside the classroom influence the learning that you do outside the classroom, but all of it, the stuff that happens inside Wheeler Odd and the stuff that happens on Sproul Plaza, all of it goes into making you a golden bear. All of it goes into making you somebody who can engage critically with knowledge, with learning, and can move the conversation forward and make the world a better place. Welcome to Berkeley and go Bears.